Hello and a very warm welcome to the Rylands Lunchtime seminar series. My name is Stefan Hans from the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing this session today. The Rylands Lunchtime seminar series highlights the breadth and quality of our unique special collections and showcases world-class collections-based research activities across the university. Today's session is coming to you from various rooms in the historic John Rylands Library, and as usual, we will be showing some of the outstanding artifacts of our collections and presenting new research on them. Our seminar today is entitled The Haunting at the Rectory, Women's Words and the Ghostly Roots of Methodism. And before I introduce our speakers, there are just a few things to mention. This event is being recorded and will be edited and made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel. Auto subtitles are available using your own settings. We are using Zoom webinar format, so this means that your camera and mic is disabled on entry. And at the beginning of the session, at the end of the session, there will be around 15 minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask one, please can you add questions to the Q&A function? These will be then selected by me as the chair and conveyed to the panel. We should have time to take a few questions, and we are aiming to stop around 1:45 p.m. So without further preamble, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Sasha Handley is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Manchester. She specialises in early modern social and cultural history in the British Isles, with a particular interest in the histories of healthcare, especially sleep practices, material culture and supernatural beliefs, especially relating to women's histories, and of course, the history of emotions. She is PI of the Wellcome Trust funded project Sleeping Well in the Early Modern World, and the author of monographs including Visions of an Unseen World, Ghost Beliefs and Ghost Stories in 18th Century England, and Sleep in Early Modern England. The latter was shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize and Longman History Today Award 2017 and won the 2017 Social History Society Prize. Sasha is a founding member of Bodies, Emotions and Material Culture Collective at Manchester, and she's Associate Director for Research, Public Engagement and Impact within the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures. Presenting with Sasha is our very own Paul Carlyle, Curator of Nonconformist Collections at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. He's responsible for manuscript and printed collections relating to the Methodist Church of Great Britain and other nonconformist denominations. So thank you both for talking to us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you everyone for joining us. Just wanted to make a note that there is some building work going on nearby. So you may at some point hear some drilling or builders chatting. We think they've gone for lunch, so we might be all right for the next hour or so, but just so you know. To begin with, we thought we would show you some items from the collections of the Methodist Archives and Research Centre, or the MARC for short. I will explain what the MARC is in just a moment. These items illustrate some of the themes of Sasha's paper today. One of them will be the main focus. We have a needle case reputed to have belonged to Susanna Wesley, who, as the mother of John and Charles Wesley, is sometimes referred to as the mother of Methodism. As we'll hear in a moment, Susanna was the mother of many other children besides John and Charles, and may have had as many as 19 pregnancies. The case is made of tortoise shell and decorated with small crosses. You may not be able to see all of the detail here, but there is a digital image available through Luna, one of our digital platforms. We have a linen preaching band or preaching collar, thought to have belonged to John Wesley. These collars are worn around the neck and fixed with thin ties. You can see in this image here how they're worn. This is a 20th century portrait of John Wesley by the painter Frank Salisbury. And we have a notebook taken from the Charles Wesley papers, which includes various accounts of the Epworth Rectory haunting, which Sasha will talk about in a moment. It also includes an account of the Epworth Rectory fire of 1709, which is illustrated here in this engraving, in which a 6-year-old John Wesley is being rescued from the fire. These items can all be thought of examples of Wesleyana. It's a term that's been used to describe items carrying images of John Wesley, mostly, and Charles Wesley as well. So ceramics, portraits, engravings. But it's a term that also covers artifacts or relics of various kinds, letters, autographs, clothing, anything that has some kind of association with John or Charles Wesley, either directly or indirectly. Methodists, generally speaking, have been exemplary record keepers, but they've also had a very strong collecting impulse since the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Methodist Church of Great Britain still collects items relating to the Wesley family, and the Wesleys are of great significance to Methodists outside of the UK, in the US, for example, which is reflected in the active collecting of Wesleyana by some libraries and archives in the US. As I mentioned at the beginning, these items are from the collections of the Methodist Archives and Research Centre. The MARC was formed in 1961 with the purpose of formalising the Methodist Church of Great Britain's record-keeping arrangements, promoting its collections, making them available to students and researchers. In late 1977, the MARC was moved to the Rylands, where it has been ever since. The collections are owned by the church and the library manages them on its behalf. The MARC contains material created, inherited, and acquired by the Methodist Church and its predecessors over the course of 200 years or more. It includes archives, printed items, and objects and artifacts. And the material it contains reflects the complex history of the church. Methodism began as a revival movement within the Church of England. Methodism separated from the Church of England after John Wesley's death in 1791. And a number of different branches of Methodism, all very similar in how they were organised, emerged in the 19th century. In 1932, Methodist Union brought together the different branches and created the church that exists today. Methodist Union also brought with it the historical collections of the different churches and its associated ministerial training colleges. It is the richest archive in the world in its coverage of early Methodism. By one estimate, it includes 1/3 of John Wesley's extant correspondence, so around 700 original letters. And it documents the social, political, and cultural influence of Methodism, both domestically and abroad, across 3 centuries. As you can see from the items we have here today, the MARC contains more than the administrative records of the church. Methodism has always had its collectors, and since the early 19th century, many ministers and laymen have assembled significant collections of Wesleyana, which have made their way into the MARC collections as bequests, gifts, or donations or purchases. For example, Susanna Wesley's needle case, which we mentioned earlier, was part of a larger collection bequeathed to the church by the layman Edmund Sykes Lamplough, an underwriter and later deputy chairman of Lloyd's of London, who died in 1940. Charles Wesley's papers were sold by his family to the Wesleyan Methodists in 1831. Material appears to have been added to this collection from different sources and at different times subsequent to its arrival in the church. But we have no records of when and how this might have been done prior to the MARC's arrival here in 1977. The origins and custodial histories of items in the collections can be very difficult to trace. The contents of this notebook from the Charles Wesley papers contains a number of different things. There's a list of household effects sold in Bristol, where Charles had a ministry, and the money raised from their sale. There are details of his income and expenditure, and a list of subscribers to concerts delivered by the Wesley brothers. And they're all from the 1780s, those particular accounts. And then there are a series of handwritten copy letters in the hand of Charles Wesley, such as a letter from Samuel Wesley Sr., Charles's father, regarding the fire that destroyed Epworth Rectory in 1709, and the several accounts of the haunting of Epworth Rectory in late 1716 and early 1717. I'll hand over to Sasha now, who will tell us more about those particular accounts.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to Stefan and the entire Rylands team for giving me the opportunity to talk about my current book project, which is focused on women's engagement with ghost stories in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as Paul's already hinted at, the main case study that sits at the centre of the book is sort of secreted within this modest manuscript in the Rylands, where there are several handwritten copies of testimonies that were solicited by John Wesley and mostly addressed to him, that were later copied out in the hand of his brother Charles. And those testimonies tell the story of the assaults of old Geoffrey. Now that is the name that John Wesley's 7 sisters had given to the ghost or demon that came to torment them in their home at Epworth Rectory in Lincolnshire in the winter of 1716 to 1717. Now, neither Samuel Jr., Charles, or John Wesley were living at the rectory at the time that the haunting occurred. So the chief witnesses to it were their parents, Samuel and Susanna, and their sisters, Emily, Suki, Mary, Hetty, Anne, Martha, and Kezzy. I've shortened those for brevity. And 2 other people, the family's maid and manservant. Now, detailed accounts of the haunting survive from almost everybody, except for Hetty and the maid. They're the only 2 that don't survive. And taken together, they reveal the physical and emotional turmoil to which old Geoffrey subjected them for more than 4 months. Now, we don't have time to look at all of the testimonies today, but I've selected one particular page opening that contains part of Suki's account, and that offers, I think, quite a nice flavour of the harrowing events. So you won't be able to probably read this on screen, but you have it there just so you can see the hand. And I've just picked this particular abstract. Suki says, "I lay in the nursery when it," that's the ghost, "was very violent. I then heard frequent knocks over and under the room where I lay and at the children's bed's head, which was made of boards. It seemed to rap against it very hard and loud, so that the bed shook underneath them. I heard something walk by my bedside, like a man in a long nightgown. The knocks were so loud that Mr. Hall came out of his chamber to us. And Mr. Hall is the vicar of nearby Haxey, who had been called to witness and help deal with the unwelcome visitor to the rectory." As Suki continues, it still continued. "My father spake, but nothing answered. It ended that night with my father's particular knock, very fierce." So there you have just a small snippet of an incredibly detailed and colourful set of narratives about this affair. And I think together they probably represent the most well-attested ghost story in 18th century Britain. I certainly haven't come across many rivals. And my focus has been largely on the sisters' reports, which are particularly interesting for the ways in which they subtly yet clearly identify their father as the chief target of old Geoffrey's anger. He seems to be the underlying cause of the haunting, according to them, and indeed the underlying cause of the family's day-to-day struggles in life. You'll notice that Suki's account referenced how old Geoffrey imitated her father's knocking. This is a knock that he used to give at the front door when he returned home, and it appears to be a noise that the girls didn't find to be particularly welcome. So she references that knock, and the testimonies as a whole show that the ghost's violence reached a peak when he physically attacked Samuel Wesley. He was pushed into the door of his study and against the corner of his desk. And those 2 furnishings really symbolise the heart of patriarchal authority in the rectory at this time. And when the sisters' reports are read alongside their few surviving letters, it's very clear that they had long-standing grievances against their father that pre- and post-dated this haunting. He stood accused of failing in his duties, both as a father and a patriarch. He had sunk the family into serious debt from which they never escaped. He was even imprisoned for debt in 1705. And his failure to provide a sufficient income meant that his wife and daughters often struggled to access even the most basic of provisions, basic clothing and medicines, for example. The archive here in Manchester includes letters describing the impact of these privations on the women's physical and mental health, on the girls' need for employment to support themselves and each other, and on their marriage prospects and fortunes. which for the most part proved pretty disastrous. Their assessment of Samuel Wesley's failings also extended to his general behaviour towards his daughters, his wife, and his parishioners. The divided political loyalties of Samuel and Susanna, for example, led Samuel to abandon the family entirely for an entire year in 1701. And his fractious relationships with people within Epworth and in Lincolnshire more broadly brought serious violence to the rectory. So the family's cows, for example, were stabbed by some of his enemies, their flax crops were burned, and pistols were even shot at the door of the rectory and under one of the windows during the 1705 county elections, after Samuel had backed two highly unpopular Tory candidates. Perhaps most devastating of all were the rumours that the devastating fire of 1709, which Paul has showed you an engraving of, and which entirely destroyed this family's home and almost killed them, was an act of arson, probably carried out by Samuel's enemies. Now, as I've already said, the Wesley's three male children weren't there when the haunting took place. And indeed, they had quite a lot of respite from these general day-to-day struggles as they pursued their formal education away from home. So the heaviest burden of Samuel's failings and behaviour clearly falls upon his wife and daughters. So in the book that I'm writing, I'm trying to give voice to their struggles, to their resilience, but also to the strategies for exposing and condemning their father's behaviour. And chief among them, I am going to suggest in the book, are the interpretations of the Rectory haunting. This case study is the main focus of what I write about, but I also place it alongside a deep well of 17th and 18th century ghost reports in which women complained about spousal or patriarchal abuse and neglect, about financial hardship and inheritance struggles, and many other grievances besides. My second aim with this research project is to establish a more prominent legacy for the Wesley sisters, whose lives have, I think, been largely overlooked within the early history of Methodism and within Methodist heritage more broadly. And I hope to do this by showing how their reports of old Geoffrey's assaults became instrumental in shaping John Wesley's ministering style and evangelical methods. In 1791, which was the year that John Wesley died, one of his enemies, Unitarian minister Joseph Priestley, described the family's reports of the Epworth haunting as, I quote, "the best authenticated and the best told story of the kind that is anywhere extant," but also as evidence that John Wesley was a man that had been, quote, "strongly tinctured with enthusiasm from the effects of false notions of religion very early imbibed." Now, Priestley's intentions here were entirely self-serving. He disapproved of the theology and methods adopted by Wesleyan preachers. And at the top of his complaint list was John Wesley's attachment to a lively world of divine and demonic spirits that intervened in the daily lives of the faithful to guide and to punish their behaviour. Now, whilst Priestley had a clear agenda, he was entirely correct, I think, in describing John Wesley's deliberate engagement with and promotion of dramatic supernatural events in support of his religious values and as a way of attracting new followers. And we find, indeed, that encounters with the walking dead, with angels and demons, were really pivotal to the appeal and success of his ministry. He judged them to be remarkable because of the profound spiritual and emotional effects that these encounters had on those that experienced them. And a good measure of his commitment to these kinds of reports are in the pages of the official Methodist publication, the Armenian magazine, which Paul has a copy of, and I think we'll unfold at some point. Also in John Wesley's journal, and in the stacks of correspondence that connected Methodist lives across time and space. The serialisation of these reports was a clever editorial strategy to build reader loyalty. Volumes 5, 6 and 7, spanning the years 1782 to 4, all included serialised snippets from historic hauntings, and that included old Geoffrey's visits to Epworth Rectory, which Wesley chiefly experienced through the words and gestures of his sisters when he collected their accounts. Methodist women were prominent authors of these reports, and like John Wesley's sisters, their narratives allowed them to speak with really remarkable authority and emotional force about domestic and spiritual affairs. These published accounts were carefully curated to support John Wesley's religious values. He was convinced that supernatural encounters offered irrefutable evidence of the soul's immortality and hope of future reward, and that they also offered the strongest possible inducements to love God and live according to his laws. These were the conclusions that he had reached in the aftermath of the family's encounter with old Geoffrey. In a letter dated the 11th of March, 1762, and published in the July 1781 edition of the Armenian magazine, a woman named only as Mrs. E.M. described an apocalyptic-style battle between God and the devil that she had witnessed and that ultimately led her to convert to Methodism. This writer eagerly shared news of her triumph over the devil and the state of her changed heart brought about by God's love in the aftermath of this encounter. Another conversion narrative from 1762 was sent by a Mrs. B. King, which Wesley published in 1782. In it, Mrs. King explained how the devil assaulted her when she was trying to fall asleep. But since she had received God's light through her Methodist faith, she wrote that, quote, "My dreams have always been pure and sometimes heavenly. Sometimes I have a clear intercourse with the unseen world." Wesley exchanged letters with Mrs. King, perhaps because her account put him in mind of that offered by his sisters, who were also assaulted at bedtime and in their sleep by old Geoffrey. And I think that's the image that we have on screen now, isn't it? That particular account.
That's right.
Mrs.
Yeah,
King.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Another account that bore many similarities to the Epworth haunting appeared in the September 1782 edition of the magazine. Entitled An Account of an Apparition in the North of England, this narrated the experiences of married couple Anne and John Lambert. They were plagued by more than a year by the malevolent ghost of a man called Henry Cook, a Roman Catholic, who had died in 1752 and into whose home the Lamberts had moved. Anne was the chief witness to shaking doors, jangling latches, terrifying noises, and, quote, a small black four-footed beast that she had seen scuttling across her bolster. The bed that Anne and John shared with their children shook whenever Cook's ghost was nearby, and one night their children were even dragged from the bed and laid on the floor in the middle of the room in front of them. Terrified, obviously, the Lamberts fled to a house at the other end of town, but the ghost pursued them and continued his attacks for several months. The account, I think, invited admiration for Anne Lambert's fortitude in resisting the spirit's assaults and staying true to her Methodist beliefs. Now, what is distinctive in these accounts is the audibility of women's voices. The testimonies were not unmediated, with names sometimes partly obscured, or their reports copied and repeated by male commentators. The authority that their words were given in the magazine, however, is really striking, as is the affinity that many women were permitted to claim with supernatural agents. This prominence, which stands in really stark contrast to the way in which women's voices were erased and discredited in other published reports of supernatural activity in the 18th century, was also echoed in John Wesley's journal. The journal, for those of you who have read it before, is really a treasure trove of supernatural reports. And I think that signals his personal valuation of them, but also their importance for the wider Methodist mission. John Wesley's deep interest in human encounters with divine and diabolical forces was very well known, and that probably explains why so many Methodist converts, and especially female converts, felt comfortable sharing their own often intimate and harrowing experiences with him. Many sought his advice about how to interpret or deal with recurrent visits from a ghost or demon, whilst others wanted to share details of how these confrontations had brought them closer to God without the fear of judgment or ridicule. Taken as a whole, these reports formed a kind of imaginative resin, if you like, that bound together a distinctive emotional community of Methodists from many different walks of life and from many different locations. Now, the decision or the act of presenting the details of a supernatural encounter to others was, I think, understood as an expression of spiritual maturity and as an act of piety for many of Wesley's female correspondents and for the women he met on his missionary ventures. The ways in which these testimonies moved John Wesley is strikingly reminiscent of the emotional power of his sister's reports of old Geoffrey. Considerable rhetorical skill was needed to create this impact, since Wesley often conducted personal interviews with those that reported being in the presence of supernatural agents, as indeed he did with his sisters. Now, this was not just to verify the truth of those reports, but also to gain a deeper insight into the dynamics of each case and their spiritual importance. In 1788, for example, Wesley visited the teenager Margaret Barlow in Darlington. She reported having had several conversations with angels, but Wesley declared that, quote, "I can form no judgment till I talk with Margaret Barlow herself." And so he did. And following an intensive Q&A, he wrote that, quote, I was soon convinced that she was not only sincere, but deep in grace, and therefore incapable of deceit. I was likewise convinced that she had frequent intercourse with a spirit that appeared in the form of an angel. Wesley noted the emotional force of Margaret's testimony, declaring that, quote, there was a wonderful power in her words that did good to my heart. And a changed heart was what really counted for Wesley when estimating the sincerity and significance of these accounts. Now, the historian Phyllis Mack has, of course, described 18th century Methodism as a heart religion. And like her, I want to take seriously the emotions of the Wesley sisters, as well as recognising their agency. The ability to feel godly emotions and to assist others to do the same was characteristic of early Methodism. The power of supernatural reports to stir such emotions gave them a privileged status within John Wesley's ministry. They were vital because emotion was judged the chief mode of communication between God and the individual, and its measured expression was a means of assessing the soul's health. So, moving towards a conclusion now, in his journal, John Wesley referenced the ridicule to which he was almost continually subjected because of his eagerness to hear and to spread reports of ghostly visitations, of ministering angels and of demons that came to test the faith of ordinary Christians. One of the capital objections to all these accounts, he wrote, is this: did you ever see an apparition yourself? No, he replied, nor did I ever see a murder. Yet I believe there is such a thing, and that in one place or another, murder is committed every day. Therefore, I cannot, as a reasonable man, deny the fact, although I never saw it, and perhaps never may. In the absence of any personal encounter with a supernatural being, Wesley drew on the powerful memories and emotions that had surfaced in the cold winter of 1716, when old Geoffrey tormented his family in Epworth. There were remarkable similarities between that haunting and the kinds of reports that Wesley later authenticated and published. The Armenian magazine and Wesley's own journal was stuffed full of women's testimonies too. Their voices, though mediated at times, were unusually audible at a time when women's perceived inability to act rationally and report faithfully in the face of a supernatural encounter led their reports to be hidden from view or buried in forgotten manuscripts. In terms of Methodist heritage, Emily, Suki, Mary, Hetty, Anne, Martha, and Kezzy Wesley have been afforded almost no significant role at all in the birth, spread, or success of evangelical Methodism. The Rectory haunting itself has also generally been sidelined as a rather embarrassing footnote within the family's history. Can I have that image now, please? So there are, for example, no locks of hair, pieces of clothing, personal or commemorative objects that carry the memory of these women forward in time, as there are for the rest of their family. The contents of this manuscript in the Rylands, I think, invite a different approach. They invite us to think about the imaginative and emotional power of their testimonies in shaping John Wesley's interpretation of old Geoffrey's assaults and also his subsequent evangelizing methods. His ministry clearly bears the impression of his sisters' impassioned accounts of the Rectory haunting and their conviction that their father had been called to account for sinking his family into penury and misery. Their reports, I think, also provided a kind of blueprint by which John Wesley judged the authenticity and value of supernatural reports that were later sent to him by members of the Methodist fold. He insisted on personal interviews with the authors of these reports so he could judge the force of emotion that underpinned them. The capacity of such accounts to move the heart was uniquely powerful and uniquely valued by John Wesley, who deployed them as tools for conversion and for sustaining the faith of a growing Methodist community in the British Isles and beyond. So intangible though they may be, the words and feelings of the 7 Wesley sisters and this manuscript deserve to be much more than a footnote in the history and heritage of the Methodist Church. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sasha and Paul, for this amazing presentation, rich of women's voices. I learned so much about gender, the supernatural and religion. I'm really grateful for this. We now have a few minutes time for a Q&A session. So if somebody in the audience wishes to ask a question, could I encourage you please to make use of the Q&A function, and I will then convey these questions to our speakers today. There has been a question about the ghost's name, old Geoffrey. The question is whether you know more about the origins and where does the ghost's name come from?
Yeah, it doesn't sound a particularly threatening name, does it? I was thinking about that just today. Old Geoffrey is a name that actually the Wesley sisters or daughters gave to the spirit. And I think it was Emily Wesley, who's the eldest, who associated it with somebody in the town of Epworth who had recently, well, I don't know if recently, but who had died in the vicinity of the Rectory. So I don't think they knew him personally, but they had heard rumours within the town that this person had existed and possibly lived there before. But what is quite interesting about the name, and it's only the girls that use it, incidentally. It's not used by Samuel Wesley, for example, who just refers to as fiend and demon and Jacobite and all kinds of other things. By the time the Rectory haunting finished, 4 months after it began, it almost became a kind of pet name a way of the girls trying to kind of domesticate and tame, if you like, the assaults of the spirit, which they clearly found very frightening. So even though it was used for different reasons, it becomes a kind of a coping mechanism, if you like, for them, I think, by the time the ghost finally leaves the building. Good question, thank you.
There have been a few more questions regarding the ghost and John Wesley's relationship with his sisters and the wider family. Is there a sense, based on the manuscript, is there a sense of whether he rigorously questioned the reports from his family, or did he investigate this with less rigor than he did in his work?
I mean, what we have to work with are, you know, a few limited materials. We have this manuscript. We have separate accounts in Samuel Wesley's journal and a few other letters that were sent to Samuel Wesley Jr., I think. And he has a bit of correspondence with his mother, which is quite revealing, because he goes through to discount all the reasons that these noises might be happening to make sure that they're not explicable by some sort of natural force. And actually, so he talks about whether they've had new servants recently who might be playing a trick on the family. He asks if the rectory has rats, which might be causing the noises. And I think Susanna Wesley even orders a horn to be blown through the house, which was a method of dispelling rats at that time, apparently, to make sure that they could exclude those kinds of natural explanations. So I think the family as a whole, I don't know about John specifically, but there does seem to be quite a rigorous investigation of the affair, and they all of them describe the kind of internal struggle that they had to accept the events as a supernatural occurrence. And the girls in particular are very keen to say, I'm not of a superstitious mind, but let me tell you what has happened. And they make a big kind of hoo-ha, I suppose, I've forgotten a better word, of the fact that, you know, they're often all in the same place at the same time. When they hear the noises, there's nobody else known to be in the house. So I think they are reluctant to ascribe it to a supernatural origin in the beginning. And it's also clear from Susanna Wesley's letters that she doesn't want news of the affair spreading more broadly, because she thinks this is going to bring discredit upon the family, who will be thought of as, you know, potentially superstitious, but worse, will be thought of as a family within whose bounds is a sinner that needs reforming, because that's the kind of obvious explanation that would have been given to this at the time, when people were thinking, well, why has it chosen Epworth Rectory? There's a sinner, there's some kind of wrongdoing to be rooted out. So yeah, I think there is rigor, even though I don't have the kind of the flaming gun in the hand of John Wesley.
And sorry, Stefan, just to say the correspondence between Samuel Wesley Jr. and Susanna is how the manuscript account begins. Actually, it's largely chronological, isn't it? In here, and it begins with roughly, yeah. It begins with their correspondence.
Thank you very much. From the questions, I've seen that there's huge interest in the relationship between the Wesley sisters and their father, and the kind of problems that they faced in terms of, so if you could elaborate a bit more on their relationship, the kinds of difficulties they faced at this particular moment in their life. Also, another question is, how did their father explain the ghost's focus on him?
I'll start with the first one, and then I'll probably need you to remind me of the second question. Yeah, so it's actually been incredibly depressing reading about these girls and women's lives and the limited correspondence that survives from them. It's very clear that as well as having an incredibly difficult childhood in which they largely kind of align themselves with their mother and attempted to sort of help her in helping the family to survive, their marriage prospects are severely impacted by the family's debt. So the eldest daughter, Emily, has to go off to become a teacher in Lincoln. And she, I think, for several years, financially supported one of her younger sisters as well, which her father was supposed to do, but was unable to do. She talks at great length about, the embarrassment of not having suitable clothing to wear and opportunities for sociability. They all, for many decades, I think, feel the impact of really difficult relationships within the town of Epworth, and the sense of intimidation and violence that they were met with as a result of, Samuel's relationships with the wider parish. And they recount some of those episodes, how he sort of publicly humiliated some of the parishioners for not having beliefs that he approves of. There were some really dramatic episodes and some quite painful reading. But I guess in terms of marriages, one of them didn't marry at all, I think for, maybe obvious reasons. Only one of them had what seems like a relatively uneventful, possibly happy marriage. The rest of them, I mean, it's like a Jilly Cooper novel. There's sort of scandal and horror littered everywhere. They rush into unsuitable marriages with men who are not well suited to them, because they're desperate to get out of the rectory as soon as humanly possible, to get away from their father. One of them marries a serial adulterer who runs off to the Caribbean. One of them marries a man who becomes a violent drunk abuser. I can't remember which one it is now, but one of them has a husband that she leaves, who then pretends that he has died so that she will turn up to his funeral and he can try and win her back. I mean, it's just, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's pretty dramatic and grim reading, and really surprising that so little is known about them, and so they feature so scarcely in the history of the family, when everyone else's history is so kind of incredibly well told and detailed. What was the second question?
The second was just quickly the father's response. How does he explain the ghost focus on him? And then I have another question for Paul.
He doesn't really try to explain it by reflecting on his own faults, at least not in the testimonies that we have, but he does try to confront it and to demand an explanation from the ghost of why it has returned to him. And he does actually call it to the study, and he says, basically, if you've got a problem with me, come and talk to me in my study rather than tormenting my children in the nursery. So I think he knows, but he's not actually willing to reflect on his own failings that might have brought them to this situation. But the account that's serialized in the Armenian magazine includes John Wesley's comment that he thinks it's a judgment on his father for his past bad behaviour. So he clearly, I guess my point is that he clearly adopts the line of argument that his sisters are putting forward in their accounts, which is, here's the person who's to blame. So he's very much persuaded, I think, to that line of thinking.
Thank you.
But yeah, in private, I don't know what Samuel was thinking about himself.
Thank you very much. And Paul, there's one question for you. Do you think the elision of women from the early history of Methodists is due in part to choices made by previous archivists and curators in what to collect and catalogue? And do you have any thoughts about what we should do to readdress this?
Yeah, I'll let Paul comment on that.
I mean, every archive is shaped by its previous archivists and curators, often reflecting the attitudes at the time as well. We see that across all sorts of different archives. It's a peculiar one with Methodism, because women are prominent in the early records.
I was going to say, it's not fair to describe Methodism as a kind of a female free archive, which was all the more surprising to me, that these really significant women at the heart of the family are just so sketchily drawn, I guess.
Yeah, and that maybe speaks to a bit of a discomfort around
I think so.
the early family life of
I think
John
so.
and Charles Wesley in particular.
Because there's a kind of conservation cult around Susanna Wesley, the mother, isn't there?
Yeah.
Huge numbers of her things survive.
That's right, yeah. And also women preachers as well in the late 18th century as well. One of the largest collections of personal papers that we have here is the Fletcher Tooth collection. Mary Fletcher was one of the earliest and probably the most popular, influential female preachers in that period as well. So
John Wesley is known as a man who gives an incredibly unusual amount of scope for women in his ministry.
Very much so. He took a bit of persuading, I think, early on, but he was open to it later on. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time. There are much more questions that should be asked and that are here in the chat. We will convey them to you as well. Thank you so much, Sasha and Paul, for this really fantastic presentation. And thanks to all of you for your audience questions and comments. And I'd also like to thank our tireless tech team who have been running this for us off camera as well. Our next seminar will take place on the 16th of November, 1 p.m. and is entitled DNA in the Archive, Using Genetics to Trace Manuscripts and Books, featuring Professor Jerome de Groot and Dr. Jeremy Penner. You can find more details about this on the What's On page on the Rylands website, and you can register from there with the Eventbrite link. You also find more information here in the chat. For now, thank you all for joining us, and we hope we'll see you all again on 16th of November. Thank you very much.